Every year, 12 million visitors pass through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Most return home with photographs and memories. But scattered throughout the park's huge wilderness are items that tell different stories. A child's shoe stuck between rocks near Clingman's Dome, a backpack hanging from a tree branch along the Appalachian Trail, its owner never found. A camera discovered years later with its final image showing nothing but darkness and what appears to be a hand reaching toward the lens. These objects mark the spots where people stepped off trails and disappeared forever, joining a list of missing people that grows longer each decade. The Great Smoky Mountains stretch across the Tennessee-North Carolina border, covering over 500,000 acres of ancient forest. These mountains are among the oldest on Earth, formed 300 million years ago when the African continental plate crashed into North America. The Cherokee called this place Shakanaj, meaning place of blue smoke, referring to the natural fog that always covers the peaks. This mist is created by chemicals released by the thick plant life, mixing with moisture to form an almost supernatural fog that can reduce what you can see to just a few feet within seconds. The park was officially established in 1934, but human presence here dates back 11,000 years. Evidence from digging shows people lived here continuously, first Native Americans, then European settlers, in the late 1700s. When the park was created, entire communities were forced to leave. 600 families lost their homes. Their churches, schools, and graveyards remained scattered throughout the wilderness, slowly being taken back by nature. Some locals never truly left. They became the first park residents to disappear into the mountains, choosing to live as outlaws in the valleys they'd called home for generations. The land itself seems designed to swallow people whole. The park contains over 800 miles of trails, but beyond these narrow paths lies wilderness so thick that rescue teams often cannot push through more than a few yards without cutting tools. The height ranges from 875 feet to 6,643 feet at Clingman's Dome, creating multiple climate zones within a single mountain face. A hiker can start in warm forest and end in conditions like northern Canada. Weather changes quickly and without warning. Temperatures can drop 40 degrees in an hour. Clear skies transform into total whiteout conditions faster than most people can find shelter. The first written disappearance after the park opened occurred in September 1938. Harold Barkley, a rock scientist from Knoxville, entered the park to study rock formations near Mount LeConte. He knew what he was doing, had good equipment, and had told park rangers exactly where he was going. 5 days after he should have returned, search teams found his camp sitting there untouched. His tent was zipped from the inside. His sleeping bag looked like someone had just used it. His boots sat neatly beside his pack, but Harold Barkley was gone. The only strange thing was his notebook, found open to a page where he'd written the same words over and over. They walk between the trees. The handwriting got worse with each line until the final words were just scratches. Search teams spent 3 weeks looking through the area. They found no tracks leading away from the camp, no signs of animal attack, no evidence of injury or struggle. It was as if Barkley had simply stopped existing. Rangers filed their reports and moved on, but the pattern had begun. Over the following decades, the disappearances added up, not all at once, but steadily, constantly. In 1946, the Hartley family of 4 vanished during a picnic near Cades Cove. Their car was found with the engine still running, food laid out on a blanket, and no signs of trouble. In 1952, 2 Boy Scout troops reported that one of their members, Tommy Morrison, had walked into a thick patch of bushes and never came out. The other boys claimed they could hear him calling for help, but the voice seemed to come from above them, then below, then from all directions at once. When they tried to follow, their scoutmaster held them back, later reporting that something about the situation felt deeply wrong. The case that truly caught national attention happened in October 1969. Dennis Martin, 6 years old, was playing hide and seek with his brother and cousins near Spence Field. The children decided to surprise their parents by sneaking up from different directions. Dennis went behind a bush and never came out. His father, William Martin, was watching from only 50 feet away. He saw his son duck behind the bushes. He looked down to check his watch. 3 seconds later, when he looked up, he heard a scream that he would later describe as not from this world, not quite human but not quite animal either. The search for Dennis Martin became the largest in park history. 1,400 people searched the mountains. The FBI joined the investigation. Green Berets from Fort Bragg were brought in. They searched for 2 weeks in worsening conditions. On the 3rd day, a family hiking 6 miles away reported seeing a messy-looking man carrying what appeared to be a child over his shoulder. The man moved with unusual speed through land that should have been impossible to cross. By the time rangers reached the area, they found only a few pieces of red fabric that matched Dennis's shirt. Nothing else was ever recovered. What made the Dennis Martin case particularly disturbing were the additional reports that came out during the search. Multiple witnesses described hearing screams that seemed to echo from impossible directions. Several searchers reported feeling watched and finding large footprints that didn't match any known wildlife. One ranger, who asked to remain nameless, claimed he found a trail of small footprints that led to a tree, then simply stopped. The prints didn't go around the tree or double back. They just ended, as if the child had been lifted straight up into the branches. Park officials keep detailed records of every disappearance, though they don't like to talk about patterns. Between 1938 and 2024, at least 73 people have vanished without explanation inside park boundaries. This number doesn't include those who were later found dead from clear causes like falls or freezing. These 73 simply disappeared. No bodies, no scattered belongings, no sign of what happened to them. The cases share scary similarities. Many victims vanish within sight of others. They step behind trees, around bends, or into fog banks and never come out. Searches often find strange details that make no sense. Clothing folded neatly and placed on rocks. Backpacks hung carefully in trees 20 feet off the ground. Footprints that stop mid-step. Several missing persons cameras have been found years later with photographs that shouldn't exist. Images of places that don't match any known spot in the park. Pictures of the missing person from angles that suggest someone else was there, though they said they were hiking alone. In 1998, experienced hiker Thelma Pauline Melton vanished on the Deep Creek Trail. She was walking with friends, fell slightly behind due to her slower pace, and disappeared on a stretch of trail with no side paths. Her friends were only a few hundred feet ahead. When they realized she wasn't following, they went back within minutes. Thelma was gone. The trail at that point runs along a steep slope on one side and a straight drop on the other. There was nowhere she could have gone without being seen. Search dogs lost her scent in the middle of the trail, as if she'd simply vanished into thin air. The search for Thelma revealed something that had been noticed, but not officially written down in previous cases. Multiple searchers reported areas where their compasses spun wildly. Electronic devices failed in specific spots that seemed to move day by day. Radio communications had interference that sounded like voices speaking backwards. One search team claimed they heard Thelma calling for help from a ridge above them, but when they reached the location, they found it had been impossible for anyone to get there without climbing equipment. Local residents have their own explanations that don't appear in official reports. Families who've lived in these mountains for generations speak carefully about things they've seen. They describe lights that move against the wind, sounds of footsteps that follow hikers but belong to nothing visible, patches of forest where the temperature drops 30 degrees in a single step. They tell stories passed down from Cherokee ancestors about doorways that open in the mist, entrances to places that aren't quite here and aren't quite there. Margaret Kelly lived her entire 93 years in a cabin just outside the park boundary near Cosby. Before her death in 2019, she kept detailed journals of strange events she witnessed. Her entries describe figures that walked upright, but moved too smoothly to be human. She wrote about finding circles of flattened grass where the plants were bent in perfect spirals. She wrote down times when she heard the voices of missing hikers calling from inside the mountain itself. Her final entry, dated 3 days before her death, simply read, "They're not lost, they're taken." The National Park Service says the wilderness is simply dangerous. They point to the park's size, rough land, and changing weather as explanations for the disappearances. This is certainly true in many cases, but it doesn't explain the cases that make no sense. It doesn't explain how people vanish in broad daylight on marked trails. It doesn't explain the physical clues that shouldn't exist. And it certainly doesn't explain the cases where multiple witnesses report things that can't be real. Consider the case of Kyle Brittman, November 2012. The 8-year-old was hiking with his father near the Chimneys picnic area when he ran ahead on the trail, something he'd done many times before. His father lost sight of him for maybe 90 seconds around a gentle bend. When he came around the corner, Kyle was gone. The trail at that point had steep slopes on both sides. There was nowhere to go but forward or back. Search teams arrived within an hour. They found Kyle's jacket placed perfectly in the center of the trail, each sleeve stretched outward as if making an arrow pointing deeper into the woods. The search lasted 11 days in getting worse weather. On day 4, something amazing happened. 3 different search teams, working miles apart, reported hearing a child's voice calling for help at exactly the same moment. Each team figured out where the sound came from and got different locations. When they compared notes, they realized the 3 points formed a perfect triangle with Kyle's last known position at its exact center. They found nothing at any of the 3 spots. Then there was Rebecca Patterson in 1976, a nurse from Memphis who vanished while taking pictures of wildflowers near Laurel Falls. Her camera was found 2 years later by workers, buried under leaves, nearly a mile from where she'd disappeared. When the film was developed, it showed Rebecca's flower photos, then a series of stranger and stranger images, pictures of forest scenes that looked normal until you noticed the shadows falling in wrong directions. A photograph of Rebecca herself, taken from above as if someone was floating 20 feet in the air. The final image showed a tunnel or cave that no ranger could identify, even though they knew every cave in the park. In the tunnel's darkness, many pairs of eyes reflected the camera's flash. In 2008, a Freedom of Information Act request showed that the Park Service had been keeping track of strange events separately from normal missing persons cases. These files, with lots of parts blacked out, mention something called Protocol 7, responses to certain disappearances. The details of Protocol 7 remain secret, but park rangers who've retired sometimes hint at things they weren't allowed to talk about while working. They speak of areas in the park that are off limits but not officially. Places where rangers won't go alone. Parts of wilderness that seem to exist outside normal space. Former ranger Dale Whitmore, who worked the backcountry from 1982 to 2007, finally spoke up in a recorded interview before his death in 2023. He described something from August 1994 that was never officially reported. He and his partner were checking out an abandoned campsite near the Sawteeth Ridge when they noticed the trees in one area were wrong. Not dead or damaged, but wrong. They grew in patterns that hurt to look at, branches crossing in ways that didn't make sense in our three-dimensional world. As they got closer, both men felt very dizzy and sick. Whitmore's partner stepped between 2 of these trees and immediately passed out. When Whitmore pulled him back, his partner couldn't remember the last 4 hours. His watch, however, showed that only 3 minutes had passed. They marked the area and reported it, but when they returned with a bigger team the next day, the trees were normal. The only proof was their GPS units, which showed their path making loops through solid rock that couldn't exist. The park's records, kept in a locked building in Gatlinburg, contain thousands of pages of witness stories that were never made public. A former worker there, who won't give their name, described reading accounts that made her question what's real. Many reports from the 1950s describe hikers meeting other hikers who knew private details about their lives, who spoke of events that hadn't happened yet, who warned them to turn back using voices of relatives who'd been dead for years. Several accounts mention finding fresh footprints of missing persons years after they vanished, as if they were still walking the trails in some other layer of reality. Dr. Patricia Caldwell, a physicist from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, did unofficial research in the park from 2011 to 2016. She was investigating reports of electromagnetic problems when she discovered something she couldn't explain. Using sensitive equipment, she detected what she described as space inconsistencies at locations where people had vanished. Her data suggested that space itself was somehow bent in these spots. The distortions were small, barely measurable, but they were there. Her research ended suddenly when her funding was pulled without explanation. She now refuses to discuss her findings, saying only that some questions shouldn't be answered. However, leaked portions of Caldwell's research notes paint a disturbing picture. She found areas where gravity behaved strangely, where water flowed uphill, where compass needles pointed to empty space instead of magnetic north. Her instruments detected what she called boundary zones, where the basic laws of physics changed. In one location near Gregory Bald, she recorded temperatures that broke the laws of physics, patches of air that were both below freezing and above boiling at the same time. Her final notes, before the research was stopped, mentioned discovering mathematical proof that certain locations in the park existed in more than 3 dimensions. She wrote that walking through these areas would be like a flat drawing trying to move through our 3-dimensional world, impossible and beyond understanding. A research team from the University of Tennessee tried to repeat Caldwell's findings in 2018. Led by Dr. Marcus Webb, they focused on areas with the most disappearances. What they found challenged their understanding of reality. Using ground-scanning radar, they detected tunnel systems that shouldn't exist, passages that appeared to go beyond the physical boundaries of the mountains. When they attempted to map these tunnels, they found that they formed impossible shapes, loops that connected to themselves without turning, passages that were both 50 feet and 500 feet long, depending on which way you traveled. The team's final report was never published. The university claimed the research was unclear, but team members later admitted they were pressured to abandon the project. Dr. Webb quit his position and now refuses to enter any national park. The disappearances continue. In April 2021, Jordan Grider vanished while hiking the Boulevard Trail. He was an experienced outdoorsman, carrying a GPS beacon and satellite phone. His last communication indicated he was taking a photo at a scenic overlook. The beacon showed him stationary for 17 minutes, then the signal disappeared. When rangers reached the location 2 hours later, they found his phone and beacon placed carefully on a rock. His backpack hung from a nearby tree. His boots were positioned at the cliff edge, pointing outward. But Jordan Grider was nowhere to be found. A search involving 200 volunteers and lasting 3 weeks found no trace of him. What searchers did find was more disturbing than his absence. In a radius around his last known position, they discovered 7 other sites where items had been carefully arranged. A water bottle balanced impossibly on a thin branch. A compass opened to exactly north and weighted down with stones arranged in a perfect circle. A jacket folded into a precise square and placed at the exact center of a clearing. None of these items belonged to Jordan Grider. They were from different time periods, different decades even. One jacket was identified as belonging to a hiker who disappeared in 1974. The Grider search revealed another pattern that investigators didn't want to admit. Search dogs brought to find missing persons in the park always acted strange at certain spots. Professional handlers reported their dogs would suddenly refuse to track, shaking and whining at invisible borders. In several cases, dogs trained to never leave their handler's side would run away in terror from empty forest. When forced to go back to these areas, some dogs became frozen with fear, others turned mean. A vet exam of these animals showed stress chemicals at levels that meant they had gone through extreme trauma, though no physical cause could be found. Handler Jennifer Morse, who had worked over 200 search operations nationwide, said that her dog, Ranger, a veteran search animal, had never acted the way he did during the Grider search. At one point, Ranger led them to a clearing where he suddenly stopped, hair standing up, growling at empty air. He then began backing away, never taking his eyes off something only he could see. Morse said that the temperature in the clearing was at least 20 degrees colder than the forest around it, and she felt a strong need to run away. When she looked at her GPS, it showed they were somehow 800 feet underground, though they stood in an open meadow. The device fixed itself when they left the area, but Ranger never fully got better. He retired from search work and would panic if brought near any forest. Retired Ranger Michael Fennick broke his silence in 2022, 30 years after leaving the Park Service. He claimed that during his time working, he'd encountered multiple situations that couldn't be explained. He described finding missing hikers' tents that appeared to have been turned inside out while still tied to the ground. He reported caves that seemed to go deeper than the mountain itself should allow. He spoke of areas where sound behaved wrong, where echoes came before the original noise, where whispers could be heard from miles away, but shouts couldn't travel 10 feet. Fenwick's most disturbing account involved a search in 1989. He was looking for a missing child near Ramsey Cascades when he found small footprints that led to a solid rock face. The prints didn't veer off or double back. They went straight into the stone. As he examined the rock, he claimed he could hear the child crying from inside the mountain. He called for backup, but when other rangers arrived, the footprints had vanished and the crying had stopped. The child was never found. The native peoples who first lived in these mountains have their own understanding of the disappearances. Cherokee elder Robert Bushyhead, speaking in 2020, explained that his ancestors knew certain places in the mountains were boundaries between worlds. These locations weren't fixed, but shifted like smoke. He said the old people knew how to recognize the signs, how to avoid walking into places that weren't really there. But that knowledge has been largely lost, and modern people walk blindly into spaces that exist outside normal reality. The scientific community remains divided. Some researchers propose that the mountain's unique geology creates electromagnetic fields that can cause confusion and seeing things that aren't there. Others suggest that the thick plant life releases chemicals that affect human awareness, but these theories don't account for the physical evidence. They don't explain the impossible footprints, the rearranged belongings, or the fact that some missing person's DNA has been found in locations they couldn't have reached. In 2023, a group of volunteer searchers looking for a missing hiker made an unusual discovery. Hidden in a cave near Charlie's Bunyan, they found what appeared to be a collection point. Dozens of personal items were arranged on natural stone shelves: wallets, watches, rings, and ID cards dating back to the 1940s. Each item was clean, showing no signs of aging despite how old they were. Among them was a journal belonging to Harold Barclay, the rock scientist who disappeared in 1938. The final entry, different from what was found at his campsite, contained a single line: "I understand now. The mountain doesn't take, it chooses." The Park Service confiscated all items and sealed the cave. They've provided no explanation for what was found or why the items were preserved. Freedom of information requests regarding the discovery have been denied, citing ongoing investigation and public safety concerns. Local hunting guides, who work the boundaries of the park, speak of unwritten rules. Never follow sounds that seem familiar but feel wrong. Don't investigate lights that move against the wind. If you find items placed too perfectly, too deliberately, leave immediately. They say the mountains test people, and not everyone passes. They describe instances where they've led groups through familiar territory, only to find the landscape changed, paths that existed for decades suddenly gone, new clearings where none should be. Robert Trentham, whose family has guided hunters in the area since the 1890s, shared something from 2015 that he'd never told police. He was leading 2 clients through a section of forest. His family had hunted for over 100 years when they entered what he called a wrong place. The trees were the right types, but in the wrong spots. A creek that should have flowed east ran west. Most disturbing, they found a hunting blind that Trentham's grandfather had built in 1953, but it was new, freshly built with bright lumber and modern nails. Inside the blind was a logbook. The most recent entry was in Trentham's own handwriting, dated 3 days in the future, describing the successful hunt they were currently on. The final line read, "Don't trust the second trail marker." They left right away. When Trentham returned alone a week later, the blind was old and rotting as it should have been, and the logbook was blank. These guides speak of something they call the gathering places, spots where they found collections of bones that make no sense. Not killing grounds where animals eat prey, but neat collections of remains from different time periods, different animals, arranged in patterns that suggest thinking. They find human bones mixed with those of animals that died out centuries ago, all showing the same mysterious marks, tiny holes drilled perfectly through the thickest parts of the bone. The Park Service removes these sites when they're reported, but new ones appear regularly. William Corhey, whose grandfather helped establish the park, maintains that the government knows more than it admits. He claims that during the park's creation, survey teams found strange things that were kept secret and never released to the public. He spent 40 years collecting accounts from survivors, people who experienced something in the mountains but made it out. Their stories are remarkably similar. They describe feeling pulled towards certain areas, hearing voices of loved ones who weren't there, seeing paths that called to them but felt deeply wrong. Most report a moment of clarity where they chose to turn back, and they all say the same thing. They felt like they'd barely escaped something that wanted them to stay. The most recent recorded case occurred just 3 months ago. Sarah Ashton, a graduate student studying forestry, entered the park to collect soil samples near Thunderhead Mountain. She was in constant contact with her research team via satellite phone. Her last message was strange. She reported finding a grove where the trees grew in perfect circles within circles. She said the air felt electric and that she could hear music, though she was miles from any possible source. Then she said she'd found a path she'd never seen before. Despite having worked in that area for 2 years, the message ended mid-sentence. Search teams found her equipment arranged in those same concentric circles she'd described. Her soil samples were labeled and organized, despite her never having time to process them. Her phone was recovered with one final photo, a path that led into a grove of ancient hemlocks. Rangers who know every trail in the park swear that path doesn't exist. When they returned the next day to investigate further, the grove itself had changed. The trees were there, but arranged differently. The path was gone. The Great Smoky Mountains continue to draw millions of visitors each year. Most experience nothing more than natural beauty and peaceful trails, but the disappearances persist. The Park Service has enhanced safety measures, improved trail marking, and increased ranger patrols. Yet people still vanish in ways that defy explanation. They step off trails and into something else. Something that might have always been here, waiting in the spaces between the trees, in the mist that gives these mountains their name. Those who study the patterns say the disappearances aren't random. They group around certain areas, certain times. They increase during specific weather, especially when the fog is thickest. They often involve people who are alone, even briefly. People who fall behind or push ahead, people who notice things others miss, people who follow their curiosity one step too far. The questions remain without answers. Where do the missing go? Why are some chosen and not others? What mind, if any, guides these selections? The mountains keep their secrets, wrapped in blue smoke and ancient silence. And somewhere in that huge wilderness, in places that maps don't show and trails don't reach, 73 people exist in a state we don't understand. Not dead, perhaps, but certainly not here. Not anywhere we can follow. Rangers still patrol. Searches still launch when someone doesn't return. But those who've worked these mountains longest know that some searches are futile from the start. They recognize the signs, the impossible last coordinates, the items arranged too carefully, the footprints that lead nowhere. They go through the motions, but they know the mountain has made its choice. Visitors planning trips to the Great Smoky Mountains should follow all safety guidelines. Stay on marked trails, hike with partners, carry emergency beacons. But know that sometimes following all the rules isn't enough. Sometimes the fog rolls in and the world changes. Sometimes the path you've walked 100 times leads somewhere new. Sometimes the mountains call and those who answer don't come back. The investigations continue, officially and unofficially. Scientists study electromagnetic fields and atmospheric anomalies. Researchers catalog patterns and correlations. Locals share whispered warnings and inherited wisdom. But the truth remains elusive, hidden in the ancient peaks and hollows of these timeless mountains. Whatever takes people here has been doing so long before the park existed, long before records were kept, perhaps long before humans first set foot in these woods. Tomorrow, 12,000 people will enter the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Most will leave with nothing more than memories and photographs. But statistics suggest that this year, 2 or 3 won't leave at all. They'll join the growing list of the vanished, becoming part of a mystery that deepens with each passing season. Their names will be added to files that few will ever see. Their families will search for answers that don't exist in any form we can comprehend. And the mountains will keep their silence, broken only by the wind through ancient trees and the whisper of fog across the ridges. What do you think happens to those who disappear in the Great Smoky Mountains? Have you experienced something unexplainable in the wilderness that defied logical explanation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more investigations into the mysteries that lurk in the spaces we thought we understood.